When we picture a lifeline, I mean, the image that usually comes to mind is uh, something aggressively tangible.
Right, like a physical object.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We visualize this thick, braided Kevlar climbing rope holding a mountaineer to a rock face, or, maybe a heavy reinforced umbilical cord connecting a deep-sea diver to a surface ship.
Something you can actually hold on to.
Yeah, a physical tether. Something engineered for failure, layered with all these redundancies. It's something you can literally grip with both hands when the whole system breaks down.
Oh, absolutely.
But if you strip away the visual world and look at modern audio-only communication, that thick braided rope just vanishes.
It completely disappears.
Right. It gets replaced by this single, incredibly fragile thread. There are no hand gestures to lean on, no eye contact to establish mutual understanding.
No shared physical environment to point at either.
Exactly. You are completely reliant on the mechanical vibration of your vocal cords to beam an abstract thought from your frontal lobe into someone else's. And you're doing this while navigating an absolute ocean of acoustic and digital interference.
It really is the definitive high-stakes, low-bandwidth environment. And, what's fascinating here is how we collectively treat it like it's the most natural thing in the world.
We really do take it for granted.
We do. We take for granted just how statistically improbable it is when a purely audio-based transaction succeeds without a single hitch. I mean, if you look at it from an evolutionary biology standpoint, human beings spent hundreds of thousands of years optimizing for face-to-face communication.
Right, we're built for in-person chats.
Exactly. Our brains are hardwired to process a massive symphony of nonverbal cues, the micro-expressions around the eyes, the tension in the jaw, the posture.
Even just the spatial context of the room we're standing in, right?
Precisely. Telephony violently strips all of that away, leaving us with nothing but a heavily compressed vocal frequency.
Which perfectly frames the absolute masterclass in transactional communication we are diving into today. Welcome, by the way, to today's deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us.
Yes, welcome. We have a really interesting source to pull apart today.
We really do. The mission of this deep dive is to extract the hidden genius in everyday interactions. And we're doing that by examining excerpts from an English language learning module. It's titled Precise Pizza Orders, Master Telephone Communication.
It's a fantastic baseline scenario.
It is. The premise is deceptively simple. A man named Bruce is trying to order a pizza over the phone, but Bruce is currently operating a pretty hostile acoustic environment.
He is battling a significant amount of background noise.
Okay, let's unpack this, because on the surface, you just see a guy trying to get dinner.
Right, it seems so mundane.
But if you actually apply information theory and cognitive psychology to Bruce's struggle, it stops being just a pizza order. It becomes this microscopic look at the fundamental pillars of transmitting data, negotiating shared reality, and managing expectations across a really degraded channel.
And the beauty of utilizing a scenario like this, especially one originally designed to teach English communication, is that it completely isolates the core mechanics of human interaction.
It strips away all the fluff.
Exactly. We aren't distracted by complex corporate jargon, and we aren't bogged down by the emotional baggage of a personal relationship. It leaves us with pure, unadulterated transactional communication.
So the sender has a specific data set and a desired outcome.
Yes, and the receiver has the means to execute that outcome, provided the data actually arrives intact.
Yeah.
But before Bruce can even think about what he wants on his pizza, he has to solve a physics problem.
He has to stabilize the channel.
He has to stabilize the channel. Because the background noise isn't just an annoyance, it's a structural barrier. The source highlights this immediately. Bruce's environment is actively fighting his transmission.
I think we need to define that a bit more. What do you mean by actively fighting?
Well, in any form of signal processing, whether we are talking about radar arrays, fiber optics, or just two people on a phone call, everything hinges on the signal-to-noise ratio.
The signal being the important stuff.
Right. The signal is the specific payload of information you are attempting to transmit. So Bruce's voice outlining his order.
And the noise is everything else.
The noise is the sum total of all unwanted interference in the environment. It's the traffic on his street, the wind hitting the microphone membrane of his smartphone, the chatter of a crowd passing by.
It's just a mess of sound.
Exactly. If the noise floor rises too high, it doesn't matter how perfectly Bruce articulates his words or how grammatically flawless his sentences are. The physical channel of communication fundamentally collapses.
So what does this all mean for Bruce and his phone? Because I think we need to look at what's actually happening inside that smartphone when Bruce speaks, because it really illustrates just how precarious this whole thing is.
It's definitely not just a direct tube of sound.
No, not at all.
Okay.
When you make a call, your phone doesn't just pipe raw analog audio to the other person like two tin cans on a string. It uses a codec.
Right, an encoder-decoder.
Yeah, it takes the analog sound waves of your voice, digitizes them, chops them into these tiny packets of data, compresses them, fires them across a cellular network.
And then the receiver's phone unpacks and synthetically rebuilds that sound on the other end.
Exactly. And those compression algorithms, they are heavily optimized for the specific frequency range of the human voice operating in a quiet room.
Which is a huge problem for Bruce.
Right. So when Bruce is standing on a 1D corner with a siren going off in the background, the algorithm just panics.
It doesn't know what to prioritize.
It can't easily distinguish between the chaotic frequencies of the street noise and the complex frequencies of Bruce forming the word pepperoni.
So it tries to do everything.
Yeah, the phone tries to compress everything at once, or it aggressively clips the audio, dropping massive chunks of the actual data packet.
Which means the pizza shop worker isn't just dealing with a quiet voice. They are receiving a synthetic, artifact-heavy, fragmented reconstruction of Bruce's voice. The acoustic payload is actively degrading in transit.
It's like, think about the audio equivalent of trying to stream a highly detailed 4K film over a fluctuating one-bar cellular connection.
That's a painful experience.
It's the worst. The cinematography might be Oscar-worthy, the script might be brilliant, but if the bandwidth is choked by interference, the system just fails.
The pixels macro block.
Yeah, the frame freezes, the audio desynchronizes from the visual, and eventually the stream just completely crashes. Bruce's vocal data is that 4K stream, and the street noise is strangling his bandwidth.
That mechanical failure of the system is a really great way to visualize it. But we also have to consider the biological receiver on the other end of that line.
The person actually picking up the phone.
Right, because the pizza shop worker isn't a digital router. They are a human being, and they are likely operating in their own highly degraded acoustic environment.
Oh, absolutely. Commercial kitchens are incredibly loud.
You have industrial ovens humming, ventilation hoods roaring, coworkers shouting over the din. When you combine the ambient noise of the kitchen with the heavily degraded, compressed audio arriving from Bruce's phone,
It's a disaster.
it triggers a massive spike in cognitive load for the worker.
This is where we get into the concept of listening fatigue, right? Like the actual metabolic cost of trying to hear someone.
Precisely. Because human hearing isn't just a passive reception of sound waves. It is an intensely active, predictive process.
Predictive, like it's guessing.
Exactly. The auditory cortex is constantly running probability models to fill in missing information. If Bruce's phone drops the phonetic data for the middle of a word, the worker's brain instantly searches its vocabulary database, cross-references it with the context of a pizza order.
And tries to guess what the word was.
Yes, it attempts to hallucinate the missing phone so the sentence makes sense.
It's basically the brain's autocomplete function.
That's a perfect way to put it. The brain is aggressively auto-completing the degraded audio. But running that predictive engine at maximum capacity requires significant metabolic energy. It is physically exhausting.
I can imagine you're just straining to catch every syllable.
Right. When the signal-to-noise ratio is terrible, the worker's brain is working overtime just to establish the baseline words, leaving very little cognitive bandwidth for actually processing the meaning of the order.
Let alone inputting it correctly into a point-of-sale system.
Exactly. This cognitive strain leads directly to what audiologists call listening fatigue. And as that fatigue sets in, the error rate just skyrockets.
Okay, I see the mechanics of that, but let me push back on the dynamic between the two parties here for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Because, I mean, I've been Bruce, standing on a noisy sidewalk, needing to make a call. And I've also been the person on the other end trying to decipher the static. It often feels like a standoff.
It does feel adversarial sometimes.
Yeah. Bruce is the customer, right? He's initiating a transaction that brings revenue to the business. Doesn't the onus fall on the receiving end to accommodate the transmission?
Like they should just try harder to listen.
Yeah, or shouldn't a business invest in better headsets or train their staff to parse through the noise? It feels somewhat counterintuitive to say the customer needs to act like a broadcast engineer just to buy a pizza.
Well, it's a natural reaction to view this through the lens of customer service, where the baseline assumption is that the business must absorb all the friction of the transaction.
Because the customer is always right, quote unquote.
Right. But if we put aside the commerce aspect and analyze this purely through information theory, the power dynamics shift entirely.
How's
In any communication network, the sender of the payload, the origin point of the signal, has the ultimate and frankly the only real control over the initial signal integrity. Bruce is the one choosing to initiate the transmission from a compromised environment.
He's knowingly launching the data packet into a storm.
Exactly. The pizza shop worker cannot reach through the cellular network and mute the traffic on Bruce's street.
No, they can't.
They cannot alter the physics of his environment. They are entirely at the mercy of whatever degraded signal actually arrives at their eardrum. If Bruce refuses to optimize the channel before he pushes the data, he is essentially forcing the receiver to solve a puzzle that he created.
So taking ownership of the acoustic environment isn't just a courtesy, it's a structural requirement for success.
It is the absolute prerequisite. If the stakes of the data matter, and in this case, the stakes are securing the correct food at the correct location, you have to take responsibility for your broadcast studio.
Even if that studio is just a street corner.
Even then, cupping a hand over the phone to create a makeshift windshield, stepping into the recessed doorway of a building to block ambient traffic noise.
Or just waiting, right?
Yes, making the executive decision to simply wait 3 minutes until you've reached a quieter space. You cannot push critical data through a broken channel and expect a flawless result.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So let's assume Bruce recognizes this. He steps into a quiet alcove, he shields the microphone, and establishes a clean, workable signal-to-noise ratio. The channel is stable.
The physical barrier is cleared.
Right. And the immediate assumption is that the hard part is over. But actually, once the acoustic environment is stabilized, the immediate next hurdle isn't conversational, it's cryptographic.
Yes, he has to transmit the most highly volatile piece of data in the entire transaction.
The address.
The address. And the source material emphasizes this explicitly as a primary point of failure.
Because it's so easy to mess up.
Extremely easy. And to understand why giving an address is so fraught with peril, we have to look at the concept of semantic redundancy.
Right, because an address behaves completely differently than standard human speech. If we are having a normal conversation and the audio drops out for half a second, I don't necessarily lose the meaning of your sentence.
That's Claude Shannon's information theory in action. Standard language is highly redundant. It has structural rules, grammatical constraints, and contextual predictability.
Like it has a flow that we expect.
Exactly. If I say to you, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy and a loud truck drives by, completely masking the final word, your brain doesn't even stumble.
No, I immediately know it's dog.
Right. Because the context and the statistical probability of that specific idiom dictate the conclusion. It instantly autofills the word.
The packet was lost, but the system recovered it using context.
Precisely. But an address possesses almost zero semantic redundancy. It is not a narrative sentence. It is a highly specific, largely arbitrary string of alphanumeric data.
It's just random numbers and letters to the receiver.
Exactly. You are dealing with numerical sequences, cardinal directions, and isolated letters serving as apartment or unit identifiers. If Bruce's address is 1550 West 43rd Street, apartment B, there is no contextual safety net.
No, not at all. If the audio drops on the word west, the brain cannot autofill it because east is an equally probable yet entirely divergent data point.
And this is exacerbated by the actual phonetic structure of the English language over a telephone line. Standard telephony truncates audio frequencies above roughly 3.4 kilohertz.
Which means it cuts off the high notes, basically.
Right. The problem is many consonant sounds rely on high-frequency friction to be distinguishable. The letters B, V, D, P, M, and N are notoriously difficult to differentiate when you compress the audio and remove the visual cue of seeing the speaker's lips move.
Which is terrifying when you realize that saying apartment B versus apartment D could mean the difference between getting your dinner or having it delivered to a stranger 3 floors up.
It changes the entire destination.
It's essentially a cryptographic hash. If a single character in the string is altered, the entire output fails.
Which brings us to a massive psychological barrier that Bruce has to overcome to successfully transmit this data. It's a cognitive bias known as the curse of knowledge.
The curse of knowledge. I see this happen all the time, and it is fascinating. How often do we rush through the information we know best? Like our own home address.
It happens constantly because of procedural memory. Bruce has lived at his address for years. He has written it on countless forms. He has typed it into dozens of web browsers.
He has spoken it aloud hundreds of times.
Exactly. In Bruce's neurological architecture, 1550 West 43rd Street, Apartment B, is no longer processed as a sequence of 8 distinct data points. Through sheer repetition, his brain has chunked it into a single, blurred-together, fluid concept.
So when he goes to speak it, he doesn't dictate it. He just exhales it, like 1550 West 43rd FP. It takes him a fraction of a second.
And in doing so, he completely ignores the cognitive reality of the receiver. Bruce is transmitting a compressed file, but the pizza shop worker is hearing this highly specific, arbitrary sequence of numbers and letters for the absolute first time in their life.
Right. We have to look at the working memory capacity of the person taking the order. There's a well-known concept in psychology, Miller's Law.
Yes, the magic number 7.
Right. It suggests the average human can only hold about 7 distinct items in their working memory at any given time. If Bruce fires off an 8-point alphanumeric string at conversational speed, he is literally causing a buffer overflow in the worker's brain.
They hear the numbers, but before their brain can parse them, hold them in the working memory buffer, and physically transcribe them into the computer system, Bruce is already halfway through the street name.
The earlier data is overwritten by the new data.
Exactly. So the worker has to stop him, ask him to repeat it, which breaks the flow of the transaction and introduces frustration.
Or worse, they try to guess what they missed.
Which leads to a critical routing error.
Which means the pacing of the delivery has to fundamentally change. When you reach the data payload of the transaction, you have to stop conversing and start dictating. You have to introduce artificial latency into your speech.
It requires deep empathy for the receiver's cognitive load. You group the numbers logically, saying 15, pause, 50, rather than just rattling off 1550.
You enunciate the directional markers clearly.
And for those high-frequency consonants that degrade over the phone line, you utilize a phonetic alphabet. Instead of saying apartment B, which sounds identical to D or V over a compressed cellular channel, you say apartment B as in Bravo.
You are manually adding the redundancy back into the data string. You are sacrificing a few seconds of efficiency to guarantee the integrity of the cryptographic key. Because if that key is wrong, the physical delivery fails.
There is no partial credit.
Right. The driver goes to the wrong grid coordinate, and the transaction is nullified. But okay, let's say Bruce executes this perfectly.
He does everything right.
Yeah, he paces the data, he uses phonetic clarifiers, the channel remains stable, and the address is locked in flawlessly. The driver now has a perfect GPS waypoint. The spatial problem is solved.
But the job isn't done.
No, because if they arrive at the correct geographical location and hand Bruce a box containing the wrong product, the entire process was still a failure.
Which necessitates a shift from spatial accuracy to product accuracy. We move from the metadata of the transaction, the location, to the actual deliverable itself.
The toppings.
The toppings.
Now, the source material does something really interesting here. It doesn't tell the listener to simply list their toppings. It very deliberately uses the phrase clarifying toppings as a foundational pillar of telephone communication. That semantic distinction feels crucial.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profound shift in communication philosophy. The difference between listing and clarifying is the difference between a one-way broadcast and a two-way synchronization.
Okay, let's unpack that. If Bruce is just listing his toppings, what is the underlying assumption he's making?
Well, if he is merely listing, saying, I want pepperoni, mushroom, and extra cheese, he is operating under the assumption that his personal dictionary perfectly aligns with the pizza shop's dictionary.
Like they define those words the exact same way.
Right. He assumes that language is a fixed, universal constant, and that his specific conceptualization of those words requires no further negotiation. It is the equivalent of a UDP network protocol, where a computer just fires data packets out into the network and doesn't bother checking if they were received or understood correctly.
He fires the data and walks away.
Exactly.
But clarifying operates like a TCP handshake. It requires an acknowledgement of receipt and an active confirmation of meaning.
Yes. Clarifying acknowledges that language is inherently messy. It recognizes that menus contain ambiguity, that words suffer from semantic drift, and that human beings constantly build assumptions based on their own localized biases.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I use a framework similar to this when looking at professional dynamics, particularly when an agency is negotiating a scope of work with a new client. It maps perfectly onto Bruce's pizza toppings.
Oh, really? Walk me through the scope of work analogy. How does that connect to clarifying versus listing?
Okay, think about the initial kickoff phase of a corporate project. A client hires a creative agency and says, we need a new website, some social media assets, and a refreshed logo.
Okay, pretty standard request.
Right. That is listing the deliverables. It's a broadcast. The agency replies, understood, we can do that. 3 months later, the deadline arrives. The client is furious because the website is only a 3-page wireframe, the social media assets are just unedited stock photography, and the logo is a minor font change in black and white.
Wow. So the agency delivered what was technically listed, but failed the client's internal expectation.
Precisely. The agency says, we build exactly what you asked for. The client says, this isn't what I meant at all. They listed the components, but they completely failed to clarify the parameters. Both sides operated on massive, unstated assumptions.
They lacked a shared dictionary for the deliverables.
Right. And Bruce faces the exact same risk on a micro scale. If Bruce lists pepperoni and mushroom, the ambiguity is staggering. Does he want the entire circumference of the pizza covered in both toppings?
Or does he want half the pizza dedicated exclusively to pepperoni and the other half dedicated to mushroom?
Exactly. If he says extra cheese, does his internal dictionary define that as a thicker layer of the standard mozzarella? Or does he mean introducing a secondary cheese variant like Parmesan or provolone?
By shifting his approach from listing to clarifying, Bruce is actively hunting down those ambiguities and resolving them before they materialize as physical errors. He isn't just transmitting data, he is establishing a bespoke, shared dictionary for this singular transaction.
He's aligning their definitions.
Right. He is saying, when I use this specific phrase, here is the exact operational parameter I am attaching to it. He might say, I'd like pepperoni and mushroom, and just to be explicitly clear, I want both of those toppings distributed across the entire pizza, not half and half.
And this becomes exponentially more critical when you consider the original context of the source material. It's an English learning curriculum.
Absolutely. The English language is saturated with shorthand, localized idioms, and heavily context-dependent phrasing that does not translate cleanly across cultural or linguistic boundaries.
It's so easy for things to get lost in translation.
Yes. If either Bruce or the worker taking the order is a non-native speaker, the risk of an unstated assumption derailing the process multiplies dramatically. Clarification acts as the ultimate safeguard. It removes the burden of interpretation from the receiver.
The pizza shop worker shouldn't have to guess what Bruce intends.
Exactly. Bruce must engineer the clarity himself.
But, let me look at this from a systems efficiency standpoint. Because intellectually, yes, absolute precision sounds ideal. We want the exact product to be visualized. But in practice, isn't hyper-clarifying incredibly inefficient?
How do you mean?
Well, we've all been trapped behind that person at a high-volume coffee shop who spends 4 minutes clarifying the exact thermal temperature of their milk, the required millimeter depth of the foam, and the specific geometric pattern of the syrup drizzle.
Oh, yes, the overly complex order.
Right. It feels incredibly self-indulgent. If Bruce treats his pizza order like he's drafting a binding legal contract, isn't he just introducing unnecessary latency into the system? The worker has a queue of other calls waiting. Time is quite literally money in a commercial kitchen.
That is the eternal tension in all communication frameworks, right?
Yeah.
The friction between transactional accuracy and transactional velocity. You want to be precise enough to avoid errors, but fast enough to remain functional.
Exactly. So how does he balance that?
Well, true. Masterful clarification isn't about applying exhaustive, pedantic detail to every single facet of the message. It is about strategic risk management. It is the ability to look at your payload and correctly identify the likely points of failure.
Identifying the likely points of failure. So applying triage to the data string.
Exactly. Bruce does not need to clarify that the pizza should be baked in an oven until hot, or that it should be delivered in a standardized cardboard box.
Right, because those are given.
Yes, those are universally shared assumptions with a failure rate approaching 0. Spending time clarifying them is wasted bandwidth. However, asking for a pizza to be split half and half with different toppings, that is statistically a massive point of failure in food service.
Yeah, for sure. Or a dietary restriction.
Exactly. Requesting a gluten-free crust for a severe dietary restriction, that is a critical point of failure with high-stakes consequences.
So the skill isn't talking more. It's talking specifically about the structural weaknesses of the request.
It's surgical precision. You scan your request for the specific ambiguities that could legitimately lead to an unwanted outcome, and you proactively patch those specific vulnerabilities. And when you do that correctly, You aren't adding latency, you are actually protecting the timeline.
Because fixing an error takes infinitely longer than preventing one.
10 seconds of strategic clarification on the front end of the call prevents a 30-minute argument when the wrong pizza arrives, which is then followed by the kitchen having to waste inventory remaking the food and a driver having to burn fuel and time executing a secondary delivery.
Which ruins the night for everyone.
Exactly. Strategic clarification is an investment of seconds that saves hours.
That reframes the coffee shop scenario entirely. It's about knowing which variables actually matter. So Bruce has stabilized the acoustic channel, he has methodically paced the cryptographic data of his address, and he has surgically clarified the deliverables to eliminate semantic ambiguity.
He's done the heavy lifting.
Right. The where and the what are firmly locked into a shared reality. Logically, the transaction is complete. He pays, the call ends, and he waits. But the source material introduces one final, critical action. A concluding protocol that shifts the entire psychological weight of the interaction.
Once the where and the what are secured, Bruce must bound the transaction in time.
He must establish the when.
Yes. The source specifically highlights asking for an ETA, an estimated time of arrival, as the necessary capstone to telephone communication. And while it seems like a simple logistical question, it is actually a deeply psychological maneuver.
Why is bounding it in time so psychologically important? Like, what happens if he just hangs up?
If Bruce simply places the order, confirms the details, and ends the call without an ETA, he steps into an open loop. He has initiated a complex, multi-step transaction, but he has left the conclusion of that transaction entirely undefined.
An open loop.
Right. In psychology, there is a concept known as the Zeigarnik effect, which states that human beings remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks significantly better than completed tasks.
Because the uncompleted task is taking up active RAM in the brain.
Precisely. The brain flags the open loop as an ongoing problem that requires monitoring. If Bruce doesn't have an ETA, he enters a state of indefinite suspension. His brain is constantly running background checks.
Is it time yet? Should it be here by now?
Exactly. Did they lose the ticket? Did I dictate the address wrong? This ambiguity breeds a very specific type of low-grade anxiety.
Which eventually boils over into an action.
It leads to the bane of all customer service, the anxious follow-up call.
Right. And I want to look at the power dynamics of asking for an ETA because it profoundly changes Bruce's standing in the relationship.
Yeah, it completely flips it.
Up until this final question, Bruce has been in a supplicant role. He is the one asking the shop for things. He is asking them to process his degraded audio, asking them to write down his location, asking them to assemble his specific dietary request. He is dependent on their capability. But the moment he says, "What is the ETA on this order?" the architecture of the power dynamic flips.
He transitions from the dependent party to the auditing party.
Yes. It's identical to the dynamic between a venture capital firm and a startup founder. When an investor hands over capital, they are taking a risk. But they don't just hand over the money and accept a vague, open-ended promise that the startup will build a product eventually.
No, that would be disastrous.
They demand a roadmap. They require a timeline with specific, measurable milestones. They want to know what is happening in Q1, when the beta launches in Q2, and when revenue begins in Q3.
They require a service level agreement, an SLA.
Exactly. The roadmap is the metric by which the investor will audit the founder's competence. By asking for an ETA, Bruce is establishing a micro SLA with the pizza shop. He is setting the exact metric by which he will judge the success or failure of their operation. It elevates the interaction from a simple request into a binding, time-based contract.
And while it might sound adversarial to describe it as an audit, establishing that SLA actually benefits both parties immensely.
How does it benefit the shop?
Well, we've established that for Bruce, the ETA provides psychological peace of mind. It closes the cognitive loop. If the shop says the ETA is 45 minutes, Bruce's brain can safely offload the monitoring task for 44 minutes. The anxiety of the unknown is neutralized.
Right, but does it really benefit the pizza shop? I would imagine a busy kitchen wants as much temporal flexibility as possible. Being locked into a strict deadline seems like it would just induce stress on their end.
It's a paradox of service operations. Undefined time actually creates more chaos than a strict deadline.
Really?
Yes. Because if the kitchen operates without providing ETAs, they become vulnerable to the anxious follow-up calls we mentioned earlier. Think about the cascading failure that causes.
Oh, I see where you're going.
If Bruce calls back 20 minutes later just to check on his order, A worker has to stop assembling a pizza, wipe their hands, answer the phone, navigate the computer system to find his specific ticket, calculate the remaining time on the fly, and verbally soothe Bruce's anxiety.
Which ironically delays Bruce's pizza and every other pizza in the queue even further.
Precisely. It introduces friction and latency into a system that requires momentum. By providing a clear ETA upfront, the business is proactively managing the customer's expectations, effectively buying themselves a guaranteed block of uninterrupted time to actually execute the task. It shields their operational workflow from external anxiety.
It's incredible how universally applicable that concept is. If you pull the ETA protocol out of the pizza scenario and drop it into a standard corporate environment, you immediately see how many of our daily communications are dangerously open-ended.
This raises an important question about modern work culture. The modern workplace is built on a foundation of open loops. Think about the standard digital interactions. You send a Slack message to a colleague. Can you review the data in this spreadsheet?
And they reply, sure, I'll get to it.
I'll get to it.
That might be the most destructive phrase in professional communication.
Because it contains zero temporal data, I'll get to it could mean they will open the spreadsheet in 5 minutes. Or it could mean they will look at it next Thursday after they finish another project.
And as the sender, you are now trapped in the Zeigarnik effect. Your task is blocked, your cognitive RAM is tied up monitoring the open loop, and you have no idea when the dependency will be resolved.
Which forces you to eventually send the dreaded follow-up message, hey, just circling back on that spreadsheet.
Which immediately breeds resentment. The colleague feels micromanaged and you feel ignored. All of that interpersonal friction, all the wasted mental energy exists purely because neither party established an ETA at the origin of the request.
Bruce's simple question, how long will that be, is a masterstroke in structural communication. It eliminates the ambiguity of the future. You lock in the data K-load, you clarify the semantic meaning, and you schedule the result. It is a brilliantly complete framework for any transactional exchange of information.
It truly is. And it's fascinating how far we've traveled from the initial premise. What presented itself as a mundane English learning exercise about a guy ordering dinner has unfurled into a comprehensive treatise on signal processing, cognitive load management, semantic synchronization, and temporal bounding.
It really covers all the bases.
It does. Let's synthesize this framework so you can actively deploy it. To truly master remote communication, you have to respect the mechanics of the system. First, you must aggressively manage the acoustic environment. You cannot push a pristine message through a corrupted channel. Take ownership of your physical space and stabilize the signal-to-noise ratio before you even attempt to transmit data.
That's step one.
Right.
Yeah.
Second, when you reach the critical payload, the alphanumeric data that lacks semantic redundancy, you must alter your pacing. Do not let the curse of knowledge cause you to overflow the receiver's working memory. Slow down, group the data, and utilize phonetic clarifiers to protect the structural integrity of the information.
Step 3 is the deliverables.
Exactly. Third, recognize that language is inherently ambiguous. Shift from a mindset of listing to a mindset of clarifying. Identify the specific vulnerabilities in your request and explicitly define your terms to synchronize your shared dictionary. And finally, never leave a transaction unmoored in time. Close the psychological loop by establishing an ETA, shifting yourself from a state of dependency to a state of structural certainty.
The underlying mechanics of this framework are surprisingly elegant, but they demand a level of intentionality that is rarely applied to everyday communication. It requires us to stop viewing conversation as a passive reflex and start treating it as an engineered process.
I completely agree.
And that brings up a broader implication I think is worth considering. We spent a lot of time analyzing the physical background noise that disrupted Bruce's phone call. But as you navigate your own high-stakes communications, consider the concept of internal mental background noise.
The mental noise.
Yes. The biases, the preconceived assumptions, the emotional static that constantly hums beneath the surface of our interactions, masking our true intent and distorting how we hear others.
That's a powerful thought.
The next time you find yourself trying to convey something critical, whether you are negotiating a complex project roadmap at work or attempting to resolve a nuanced conflict with a partner, ask yourself, are you simply broadcasting your data into the noise and assuming it will be understood? Or are you actively engineering the channel, surgically clarifying your meaning, and securing a shared timeline for resolution?
That is exactly the kind of structural audit we all need to run on our daily interactions. Because when you are relying on that fragile, invisible thread to transmit your thoughts, assumption is the enemy of transmission. You have to build the clarity yourself. Thank you for exploring the architecture of communication with us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away with the tools to stabilize the signal in your own complex environment. Until next time, keep your channels clear, your data paced, and your expectations firmly bounded.